recording and I give you.
I think there's something that's going to pop up.
Yeah, oh, I see. Okay, yeah, got it. Fancy. I thought maybe it was a legal thing, so I didn't see you.
Yeah, I think it's so good morning, Jack. I've known you a long time and it's really nice to talk to you again and in this format. Um, you are Dr. Jack Weinstein, you're a professor of philosophy. You work at the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of North Dakota. You're my neighbor. You are an Adam Smith scholar. You do many things in philosophy. That's one of them. The other thing, one of many things, is you are the director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, and you have a radio series with episodes that I've heard many of, and maybe some of the students have heard some of these episodes. When we're going to discuss that in a bit. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Claudia. I love visiting your classes. It's always a joy to get to talk to your students in the context of language and translation and culture. It's a niche that that I don't get to visit as much as I would like in the classroom. So this is really a pleasure for me, and of course, it's an honor to be asked. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
We have read the selections of Genesis that you have asked us to read. Ooh, there we go. Oh, we can't see that very well. And we have listened to the Why Do We Need a New Translation of the Bible with your guest, Robert Alter, who is also the translator of Genesis. And I have to admit that I loved reading these selections because I've read the King James Bible version many, many, many times in a younger life. And I haven't returned to what my Christian tradition calls the Old Testament with the mind of an intellectual or the mind of someone who is not seeking a narrative to explain religious belief. One I did in college go back to the Sermon on the Mount, which is New Testament, which has nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. And it was transformative. I suddenly realized that I could view Christ as not simply, in a complex way, an activist. And it shifted my appreciation for a text that I used to hold sacred. I still find it infinitely interesting, but it's complex. And I wonder if our students are coming to this book of Genesis with lots of complexity in their own lives about belief systems that they may or may not embrace. And then how do you treat maybe a sacred text as a literary text? Is that okay? And are you forsaking your religious beliefs if you suddenly sort of look at it with that lens? So when I'm first approach it, these are the questions that are bubbling up into my consciousness.
So well, first of all, let me say that when I was listening to the radio episode again, and I know you had this experience too, there were a lot of things that I thought I was going to say that were already in the episode. So I think some of the stuff that we're going to talk about is going to be supplemental, and I'll try not to repeat too much of it. I'm also going to fall back on my personality and already start by disagreeing with you about something, which is you said that the Sermon on the Mount has nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. The Sermon on the Mount has everything to do with the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible has nothing to do with the Sermon on the Mount, right? And what I mean by that is when Jesus is talking, he is fulfilling the mission that Matthew describes him as fulfilling. And I pulled it up while you were talking so I could get it exactly right, which is, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. right? The purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to take the Hebrew Bible, particularly Leviticus and Exodus, and translate it to a new audience, to supplement it. And depending on how you take it seriously, how seriously you take it, and all that, there is a tradition that says that the Hebrew Bible can be reduced to, and I don't mean that negatively, the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, that in itself is an idea that is echoed by many other religions, and that is actually taken from Rabbi Hillel. But Hillel doesn't say do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Hillel says, do not do unto others that which is hateful to you. And those two things are very different, because I myself find the golden rule to be tremendously narcissistic and selfish, right? I don't think that we should treat others as we want to be treated. I think we should treat others as they want to be treated. And that at the core of all moral activity is a kind of empathy and a kind of entering into other people's perspective. Rabbi Hillel's perspective, however, do not do unto those that which is hateful to you, says if something causes you pain, assume it's going to cause someone else pain, right? Use your experience for the negative, not the positive. Use your experience to avoid hurting someone. So the tradition itself that Jesus is coming out of, that the writers of the Gospels and all the other books in the New Testament, is entirely built on the Hebrew scriptures, because Christianity is what's called a supersessionist religion. It's a supersessionist religion in that it seeks to supersede Judaism. It seeks to take what was there and replace it, not abolish it in Jesus's words, but replace it. And so historically, that's been a real problem, because Christianity historically has wanted, convert Jews, right? Christianity is an evangelical religion, so it wants to convert Jews. But if you convert Jews, then there are no Jews to act as witness for Christ and Christ's miracle. And this led Augustine, in the church, and I don't want to get too far afield in this, but in the church, Paul, the Apostle Paul, forms the church, and Augustine forms the theology. And so Augustine has this problem, the Jews. And so what he wants is to not let the Jews succeed, because if they succeed and they don't believe in Christ, it diminishes Christ. But if he converts everybody, then there's no witness to the miracle, and there's no reason to believe that Jews ever existed. So Augustine famously said, let them live, but do not let them thrive. And that's one of the origins of Christian anti-Semitism, is that Augustine encouraged the isolation of the Jews, not letting Jews have certain kind of jobs, eventually leading to moving them into the ghetto, which is an Italian, this, and you can talk about the etymology better than me, but ironworks, by the factory, where all the Jews were behind an iron gate, and that's where the word ghetto comes from. So all of that stuff is a reaction to the Hebrew Bible, and all of that stuff builds on the Hebrew Bible. But the Hebrew Bible, well, first of all, it was quote unquote written before the New Testament, but also the Hebrew Bible is uninterested in the New Testament, because Christ and the apostles and Revelation and all this kind of stuff, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We don't care, right? That Bible doesn't care. So I think, and I'll say, I don't want to just talk, right? But I think that this points to three different ways that you can approach the Hebrew Bible. And two of them are talked about in the episode. The first is you approach the Hebrew Bible as a Christian. And so you're reading it as a prefigurement of Christ. You're reading it as a setting up of themes that the New Testament is going to take and run with in an attempt to supersede, to replace Judaism. You can read it as the Hebrew Scriptures, as not necessarily as a Jew, although that certainly helps, to see it as a text in itself. But there's another way, and I think that this is what you are getting at. You can also read it as an educated person. You can read it as an intellectual. One of the things that we in our culture face that is unique for the last 50 years is, I guess that's right, 50 years or so, is for most of human history, there was a consensus of what it meant to be an educated person. There was a sense of what the canon was, of what you were supposed to read, of what you're supposed to know, of what languages you were supposed to speak. This is why Robert Alter, in the in our discussion, he talks about Flaubert, he talks about Lolita, he makes all these references because he's assuming a certain commonality of education. But along comes the 1960s, and the 1960s was the destruction of the canon. It was the destruction of the sense that there is one single definition of what it means to be educated, because that vision of education didn't include African-American traditions. It didn't include women writers. It didn't include Asian writers per se, Asian, both South Asian and East Asian. It included Islamic writers, but it didn't include those. It didn't include, obviously, different sexualities and things like that. And so what happened because of the 1960s and the early 70s is that there became a chaos in terms of knowledge, a sort of anarchy. And there was, I don't have to get into it, but in the 80s, it went extremely in one direction. So you would have entire English degrees where no one read William Shakespeare, right? Now that seems to be equalizing. But this is important because when you read the Hebrew Bible, if you read it as an intellectual, if you read it as an educated person, what you're going to see from the very beginning is all of the anticipations of our literature, our film, our art. So here's a very, very simple example for your students. Anytime in a movie you see rain, it means that there's that chaos is happening, and it's chaos usually before change. Rain symbolizes the confusion and the lack of control in the midst of right before some kind of change. Where does that come from? It comes from the Genesis vision that God creates order by separating the water from the land, the sky from the ground, and that since the water coming over the land is that which we have to impose order, the metaphor, the symbolism, I should say, the symbolism of water and rain signifies something to the educated viewers. Additionally, historically in Anglo-Saxon, actually in almost all film traditions, frankly, when you dive into water, it means rebirth, right? Because of that same sort of notion. So I think it's really important that if we're looking at sort of the Alter conversation, that we recognize that when you're reading Genesis, and of course all the other books of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, you are reading the guidebook to our culture, and you are getting the clues and the metaphors and the visions that help you understand anything that's beneath the surface. And regardless of the religious stuff, you cannot understand our culture if you don't have a relationship with this book.
So that's where I want to go in a big way. One of the things we've done in the class is we've looked at the Popol Vuh. This is the Mayan treatise. It's actually a performance that was written down by the colonizers. So it is a hybrid text in some ways. But in that text, God, a kind of God, practiced creating man and failed, had to do it 3 times before he got it right. And there's something about that is so extraordinary to think about. And of course, most of us have not absorbed, are not undergirded by the Popol Vuh. Mostly because that disappeared and has been recently available to to us. And when I say that, I mean, I'm sure there are oral traditions in Mayan and Quechua culture that have maintained that. But so I don't mean to erase that possibility or that reality. But how we know we breathe the air and we swim in the waters of Judeo-Christian culture. And I like your example, and I'm wondering if you can give us more examples of how this undergirds Western perspective. I like the example of the rain and the water. Can you do some more of that?
Sure. And let me just say one thing let me say two things historically, and I'll give more examples. The first is, one way that this manifests itself is the fact that the slave Bibles that slave masters gave the slaves in order to convert them to Christianity or educate their slaves' morals, they excluded Exodus, the book that talks about the Hebrew slaves leaving Egypt and Moses coming and, let my people go, and the plagues and all that kind of stuff. Why? Because they were afraid that would give the slaves the idea that they themselves could revolt and that they deserve freedom. So the Bible has been utilized and manipulated in order to justify culture. So it's not just that culture is justified by the Bible, or that rather culture builds on the Bible, but the Bible builds on culture. It's a circular relationship. Also, and I want everyone to think about this theologically, because this is really important and this is really hard. In Christianity, the goal of the Christian is to be redeemed, right? It's an individualistic, you either have a personal relationship with God if you're a Protestant, or you work within the institution of the church if you're a Catholic. And you seek redemption through loving God and having faith, and there's disagreement about how important good deeds that is, depending on denomination. What makes Jews the chosen people, as the phrase goes, is that in Jewish theology, God doesn't complete the creation. In Christian theology, God creates the creation in 6 days, and then on the seventh day, God rests. In Jewish theology, God works on the creation for 6 days, doesn't complete it, and then rests, and it is the job of every Jew to complete creation. What makes you a Jew is that you agree to work with God to make the world a perfect place. And so there isn't this sense of individual redemption. There isn't this sense of working for an afterlife. The goal is to make the world a perfect place for all people, not just Jews. Now, the way that one does that, depending on how conservative, or traditionally you are, is by following the laws and Exodus and Leviticus. But there's an old Hasidic myth. Hasids are the very, very Orthodox Jews that you've all seen in pictures with the hats and the beards and the black suits and the side curls. And there's a myth, there's an old legend that when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments, he presents it to the Jews for acceptance, right? For the covenant. You've all heard this, the covenant. It's a contract, they agree. And the first part of the legend is that every Jew from all times, all places in history was collected at the bottom of Mount Sinai. So according to this legend, I was there, my daughter was there, John Stewart was there, right? Natalie Portman was there. All these people were there. And so every one of us had to consent to working on this perfection. But the legend continues that while Moses was presenting this for people's consent, God was holding Mount Sinai over all of the Jews, that as if they said no, he would drop, I don't like to say God would drop the mountain on them. And since Jewish theology is all corporeal, is all bodily, this would destroy the Jews. So we were consenting, but we were consenting under duress. Now, think about the Isaac and Abraham story that you all read, the sacrifice of Isaac, right? Which is a really problematic story, although it is always depicted as Abraham binding his young son Isaac and taking his young son, who's sort of oblivious, to the sacrifice. But in fact, there is tremendous disagreement as to how old Isaac was. Isaac, by the way, means laughter in Hebrew, so there's a tension there, and he's named laughter because Abraham and Sarah are 80 years old when God says, you're going to have a son. And Sarah goes, bah, I'm 80. I'm not going to have a son. But God says it, and poof, she has a son. So they name him Isaac. But the estimates range from a teenager to a 35-year-old. There's tremendous disagreement. He's not an infant. He's probably a teenager, probably 16, 17. And one of the clues that gets ignored is that Isaac is carrying his own wood on his back for the sacrifice. If you're a baby, if you're a 2-year-old, you can't carry wood. Maybe you could carry a twig, right? But you can't light a sacrificial fire. So Abraham has to sacrifice Isaac. Isaac has to be sacrificed. They're ordered to do this, yet they also have to consent to do this. So what does it mean to consent to something that God orders you to do? And I have my own interpretation of the story, but the fundamental problem is when you are dealing with an all-powerful God, the choice to do something is theoretical at best. And this again, this notion, right? This notion of redemption versus healing the world, which is what it's called in Hebrew, tikkun olam. Healing the world is very different. So think about Harry Potter. Think about The Matrix. Think about every movie where someone has to die in order to end the story and save everyone. That's Christological. That's a Christological interpretation, right? Harry Potter is Jesus, right? He has to die. Where does he go when he dies? He goes to the station called King's Cross, right? I love the books and I love J.K. Rowling's writing, politics aside, but she ain't subtle, right? So Harry Potter dies and goes to King's Cross. Keanu Reeves plays Jesus in every single movie he ever was in. Even when he plays the Buddha in brownface in Little Buddha, he's still Jesus. Imagine the differences in the stories if the solution isn't someone has to die, but rather people have to work together in order to heal the process. People have to build something together. We see those things. We see those things in the classic movies like Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven that was built on that. Or if you were a Star Wars fan, there's an episode of Mandalorian that's stolen from that. And it's always the hero comes to, and you've all seen sitcoms or movies with this trope. The hero comes to save the village from bandits. And in order to save the village, the hero has to educate the village how to defend themselves, right? And they all have to learn how to use spears or guns or whatever it is. This is an alternative interpretation, right? And it comes from Asia, right? It comes from Seven Samurai, which is Akira Kurosawa film from the 1950s. I think 50s, not 40s. And that's an alternative. So imagine what it would be like if instead of Harry Potter dying to save Hogwarts, Harry Potter said, look, let's all hold hands and let's all figure out what good works we can do to make he who shall not be named, footnote on that for just a second, he who shall not be named disappear like the Wicked Witch of the West. Now, why is that important, he shall not be named? Because the name of God is something that you cannot utter. The name of God is so powerful, just the utterance of it causes turmoil, creation. I don't know how many of you still watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, but in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the climactic scene happens and the people are melting at the Ark, Indy says to Marion, "Don't look, Marion, no matter how hard it is, don't look." That comes from Moses averting his eyes when he sees God's ass. That's the one part of the body that ever gets shown of God. Moses sees God's backside, but he sees his ass. So imagine what would happen if all these people worked together. Now, there was something else. There was somewhere else I was going to go with that, and I can't remember. That's an entirely different narrative. It's an entirely different framework. And so, again, all this stuff comes out of the Bible because the Bible is is the foundation of almost all of our metaphors. And I wish I could remember the other thing I was going to say, but it'll pop into my head.
It will. What kind of question would you ask the students as they're reading and they're thinking about these things? What kind of question sort of emerges as a way for them to hang on to a thread and to develop it?
So this is really complicated because what makes reading the Hebrew scriptures so difficult is that we all think we know things that aren't true. And I don't mean the Bible isn't true. I mean things about the Bible that aren't true. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? What is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Your students are going to say sodomy, right? Your students are going to say homosexuality. That's not the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story, right, is that God sees the cities as wicked and he wants to destroy them. So Abraham, the most righteous of all the Hebrews, and the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're often called the Abrahamic religions, says to God, "Look, if I can find," I always forget the exact numbers, but we can check the book if you want. If I find 10 righteous people, are you going to destroy the whole city? Are you going to, destroy the 10 righteous with the wicked? Are you going to destroy a city for want of 10 righteous people? And God says, okay, if you find 10, I won't destroy the cities. God says, Abraham says, well, how about 9? And God says, okay, 9. And then Abraham says, how about 8? Because the Middle Eastern religions are a haggling religion. But also Abraham is arguing with God. Abraham is messing with God. He's the only one who does that. If I forget, just tell me, just say the word Israel, and I'll say the thing that I don't want to. I'll write it down. It's not okay. Not a professor. And then he gets down, I think, to 3, and then God poofs away, right? Because God poofs away because God knows that Abraham's going to say 2 and 1, and God doesn't want to do that, right? What happened? What happened was the angels of God went down and were treated badly in Sodom and Gomorrah. So after this happens, God has to send down more angels to see if there's a righteous person. And he finds Lot, and he goes to Lot's house, and Lot opens the door because in the Hebrew tradition, you welcome a stranger. Abraham used to hang out on the edge of camp and look for strangers who were walking into camp and invite those people into his tent. And Lot is continuing the tradition. So the angels come in and they're in Lot's house, and all of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah know that the angels are there, and they knock on the door and they say, "Let the angels out, for we want to know them." Now, what that means is that they want to rape the angels, right? That's what "know" means in this context. Footnote to that too. Lot says, "They are our guests. You can't do that. But look, I have 2 beautiful daughters. Let me send them out to you, and you can rape them instead. And the angels say, no, we're not going to do that. I'm sorry, the people say, no, we're not going to do that. The angels escape, and then Lot and his family are told to flee by God right before they destroy. And Lot's wife isn't supposed to turn back, but she does, and she turns into a pillar of salt, whatever the hell that means. So what's the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? You can say the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is rape, but since the people are both men and women, right, and this is really emphasized in the King James Version, it can't be homosexuality, right? It can only be rape. But what the Jewish tradition actually says is that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was lack of hospitality. That's why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Now think about how different the world would be if if people actually knew what the Bible actually said, right? Which is, you need to be hospitable. You need to welcome the stranger. It's not anti-homosexuality. It isn't even anti-rape, because what we mean by rape is entirely different than what the Bible means by rape. And so just think about how the word changed. Now, there are two footnotes that I had. The first is, remember I said the people came and said, bring them out so that we can know them. People talk about literal interpretation of the Bible, but of course, no literal interpretation of the Bible is possible. First, because it's translated from Hebrew, and then in the New Testament, Greek, and then there's bits of Aramaic in there. So there's already that problem. But the Bible speaks in metaphor, and the metaphor for homosexuality, which is, and there's controversy as to whether it's actually homosexuality or not, but we don't have to get into that, is a man shall not lie with another man like he lies with a woman. Now, if we take that literally, all that precludes is same-sex naps, right? What does it mean to be literal? To be literal is to take the words literally, to lie with a man as if he were a woman. What does that mean? You're lying down on a bed, and you're taking, there's nothing about sex there, because it's to lie with. Now you can say, but lie with means sex, but then you're not taking it literally anymore, right? So you can claim that the Bible is revelation. You can claim that the Bible is truth. But in order to make sense of that, you have to distinguish between what I always call literal truth and literary truth, right? Literal truth is the truth of a story, that the words are exact and the thing happened as the way it happened and all that kind of stuff. But literary truth is the truth that comes from allegory, the truth that comes from the stories we tell. So I'm trying to think of, you read a book, you watch a movie, you watch a television show. I have an example in my head, but I can't remember it. That you just say, oh my God, this really speaks to me. This teaches me something. That's a kind of truth. It's a kind of speaking about reality, but it's not literal. So if you take Genesis literally, it's incoherent. Why? Because the earth took 6 days, God took 6 days to make creation, but God didn't create the sun and the earth until, I think, the third day. So how can there be day and night if there's no sun and earth, right? So it has to be allegorically. It has to be allegorical. Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve. God puts them in the Garden of Eden, and God says, don't eat any, you can do whatever you want, just don't eat from that tree, right? And what's the tree? The tree is the tree of knowledge, the tree of knowing good and evil. And so when they eat we always say apple, there's a case to be made that it's actually a pomegranate, but you eat the apple, and they eat the apple, they see that they're naked, and then they hide from God. But here's the thing. What does the tree tell them? The tree tells them knowledge, good and evil. So what's the thing that they don't know before they eat the apple? Good and evil. What's good? Obeying God. What's evil? Disobeying God. So they don't have the capacity to know that eating the apple is wrong. They don't have the capacity to make the judgment that they're acting evilly. So the most you can say about Adam and Eve is not that they violated the commandments maliciously and therefore should be exiled, because that's incoherent. They didn't have that capacity. The most you can say about them is that they're like God's pets. Right. A couple of days ago, there's all sorts of chaos going on in our house. We have a dog, Oscar, and I had made 4 schnitzels that were being ready to cook. So chicken schnitzels. And so chicken fillets covered in bread and egg, like fried chicken, basically. And when I was dealing with some of the chaos, Oscar got into the kitchen and ate all 4 schnitzels in like 30 seconds, right? 2 pounds of chicken, 4 eggs, half a box of breadcrumbs. Now, Oscar knows he's not supposed to eat the chicken, right? He knows he's not supposed to eat off the table, but dogs are scavengers and dogs have limited intellect. And so am I gonna kick Oscar out of our lives, throw him out of the house and say, we're taking your collar back, scoot, never come back because he ate the schnitzel? Of course not. If I catch him in the act, I can yell at him and send him out in the backyard for 2 minutes, right? Which he knows I go, Oscar out, and he knows to go out. But then he's a dog. So 60 seconds later, he forgets why he's out there. So you can only punish him while it happens. Adam and Eve had no idea what they were doing, right? Adam and Eve were incapable of making that decision, and God's punishment was way over the top. God has a serious anger problem. And so the fundamental problem with the students encountering the book is that it's impossible for anyone to encounter the book for the first time, because they're going to read the book in order to confirm or see or read as the stories that they tell, right? There are 3 different stories of creation in Genesis, not just one. No one ever brought the animals into the ark 2 by 2, right? None of that's true. And so if you want to take the book seriously, what you have to do is you have to unlearn by reading the book rather than learning by reading the book. And that's A, a hard task, but B, it's also runs counter to every bit of tradition that we have about the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is supposed to teach us things, right? Now, one other thing. I said footnote Israel.
Yes.
The word Israel literally translates as he who wrestles with God. And so in the Jewish tradition, and this goes back to the Abrahamic thing of haggling over how many people, in the Hebrew tradition, it is not only acceptable, it's required to argue with God. It's the name Israel comes from God comes to the angel of God comes to Jacob in the middle of the night, and they wrestle, and God wins and makes Jacob grab God by the upper thigh. That's how people made promises in Hebraic times. They grabbed the upper thigh, and in exchange for that, the covenant was created, and all of Jacob's descendants would become blessed and number the stars and all that kind of stuff. So why is that important? That's important because what's the greatest sin in Christianity? The greatest sin in Christianity is doubting your faith. The greatest sin in Christianity is not believing in God and not believing that God has given you these commandments and rules. And so if you give charity, and you give charity reluctantly, or if you give charity even though you don't believe in it, then it doesn't count. Why? Because the word charity in Latin means Christian love, Christ's love. So Christians give charity out of the goodness of their own heart and out of belief in God. And so if you argue with God, or if you disagree with God, you are by definition a bad Christian, and by definition can't give charity. Jews don't give charity. Why? Because they don't engage in Christian love. Jews give what's called tzedakah in Hebrew, which translates as justice. And the meaning of justice is you do what you're supposed to, no matter what. And you can grumble and you can complain and you can deny that God exists, but you still have to do it. And there are many people who claim that there's actually no concept of sin in Judaism at all. And there's a reason for that, and that gets complicated. But let me give you the classic example of how this works. Right? In Elie Wiesel's Holocaust memoir, Night, the Jews in the concentration camp are, very angry, and they're angry at God. And so they put God on trial. They put God on trial for being absent and letting all of these people die in the concentration camps. And they come to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. Right? In the trial, they decide that God can't exist because this wouldn't have happened. When they're done, it's time for afternoon prayer. So they leave the trial and they go pray. They just concluded that God didn't exist, but they're Jews and they have to do what they're supposed to do. So they pray, even if they don't believe it. Now, those two things are fundamentally different categories and fundamentally different filters of understanding. And so think about all of the movies, pardon me, but Star Wars is a great example of this, but you'll all have your other versions where, one of the secondary characters, like Han Solo, doesn't believe in the cause. And then throughout the process of the story, they're convinced. And so by the end of the story, they are true believers. Han Solo says in The Force Awakens, are the story, I didn't believe them either, but Luke's, the Jedi, the Force, it's all true, right? Because it's a Christian model. And the goal is to get people to believe, to have faith. But with the Jewish model, the faith doesn't matter. You're just supposed to do what you're supposed to do. You get to argue with God. You get to complain with God. You get to bitch about God, whatever. I read this huge book years ago called Blasphemy, and the first chapter was on Judaism. And what the author argued, and I don't know if this is true, but what the author argued is the only blasphemy in Judaism is using God to curse God, right? Using God's name to curse God. So, quote unquote, God damn you, God, or something like that. So, I guess the point of all this is you have to both learn and unlearn as you read the book, both because you're filled with tons of misinformation about the book, and you have to get past that. But also, everything we do and everything we read and everything we see is somehow intertwined with the book. So even if the facts of this is the story of Abraham and Isaac, this is the story of the flood, this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, even if those are not true, you still have to get past these fundamental assumptions, like the hero has to die to save everyone. The goal is to get the scoundrel to believe. Those sorts of things. Oh, and also, by the way, Jesus' apostles were probably 15 years old. So that's the core of my spiel, I think.
So, the example of Adam and Eve and the pets and Oscar. So, many Christian denominations talk about that as original sin, and that's how we're cast. And you've just completely dismantled that. And I'm wondering how. So if creation has happened multiple times, is because, of course, the earth was destroyed, right? And then Noah is the father of everything. But how does the Jewish tradition reckon with Adam and Eve and Isaac, Abraham and Isaac, and then also because they're looking at it as allegory, right? So. And then the other question is, I remember a long time ago asking you about Job, and you said, well, that's just what Jews do. Because I just remember being so troubled by by Job and his audacity, and his suffering, just continued suffering. And maybe you could, I don't know if that, maybe those two things are linked, maybe they're not linked.
So those are tremendously good and important questions. And the first thing to recognize is that what we mean by original sin is a lot more complicated than people are used to, because when people talk about the Immaculate Conception, I referred to this very in passing in the Bible, in the monologue of the episode, people will ask, unless they're educated Catholics, they'll say the Immaculate Conception is Jesus's birth. That's not true. The Immaculate Conception is the conception of Mary. Why? Because according, again, to Augustine, original sin is passed from the father to the mother. The seeds, the devil is sown into the seeds of man. That's the phrase. Of course, he said it in Latin, but that's the phrase. What that means is that when a man has sex with a woman and impregnates her, he is passing original sin onto her, and she becomes a sinful and impure vessel. God is going to impregnate, whatever that means, Mary, and Mary is going to give birth to Jesus. But Jesus can't come out of an impure vessel. So Mary has to be born, not Jesus. Mary has to be born without original sin. How is Mary born without original sin? Mary's parents have sex, and they don't pass original sin on to Mary because it's a miracle, an immaculate conception. So the reason why this is so important, and so you can see two things that are really important here. The first is that women, once again, are the sinful, are impure, and have to be cleansed, right? But the second is that human beings in Christian theology are born to be redeemed, right? If they're not born without original sin, then they don't have to be redeemed, right? If they live a good life, then it's fine. Judaism doesn't have any of that. And Judaism doesn't have any of that because the passing on of being Jewish is hereditary, not metaphysical, right? People will pass over when they read the Hebrew scriptures, and Shlomo begot Sarah, and Sarah begat Bill, and Bill begat Mario, and Mario begot Jar Jar Binks, whatever, right? Those things, those are incredibly important, and they're incredibly important for two reasons. Let me say one thing too. The first is that it allows people to tell time, right? So basically how much a generation is, so you can count the generations to figure out where creation was, which is where people get that number 6,000 year old. Okay. The second is that it shows that the lineage of the tribes are the Hebrews or the Israelites. You can connect people to people because in traditional Judaism, it's a matriarchal line. And it's the religion is the religion of the mother. Now, there is no such thing, and this is really important. I say this to my students a lot. There's no such thing as Judaism. There's no such thing as Christianity. There's no such thing as Islam. There are Judaisms, there are Christianities, and there are Islams. And every religion has a conservative, a reactionary, a liberal, a revolutionary. And so there are, right, just like there are Christian fundamentalists and very, very liberal Christians. There are Jewish fundamentalists like the Hasid and the Orthodox Jews, and they're very, very liberal Jews like me, right? I eat bacon. I'm not wearing a kippah, right? The Orthodox Hasidic Jews believe in the literal word of Genesis. They take Genesis literally. They believe that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures were literally written by Moses, right? Because they're fundamentalists, right? The way that there are Islamic fundamentalists, the way that there are Christian fundamentalists, and often the Jewish fundamentalists do horrible things just the way other fundamentalists do. The more liberal you get, the less literal you take it, until you get to Reconstructionist Jews, which are the most liberal, and they see Judaism as a culture, right? Rather than now, in the late 19th century, this metaphysical notion of Judaism led to a genetic definition of Judaism. And that genetic definition of Judaism led, among other things, to the Holocaust and the Nuremberg laws, because what the Nuremberg laws said was you were a Jew if you were 1/4 Jewish. You hear this phrase all the time, half Jewish. And I'm like, which half? My bottom half or my top half, right? But if you were 1/4 Jewish, you were sent to the camps. That's one grandparent. In American tradition, you are Black if you have 1 drop of Black blood. It's the 1 drop rule, right? So we talk about mixed race. There were phrases that no one uses anymore: octoroon, quadroon, and mulatto. A mulatto was a Black person with one white parent and 1 Black parent. A quadroon was a person who was quarter Black, right? The equivalent of Nuremberg laws. An octoroon is someone whose 1 great grandparent was Black. But all of those people are considered Black, because in America we hold, right, that if you have 1 drop of Black, you're Black. Now, there are 2 things about that. The first is that the Nazis actually came to America and studied the Jim Crow laws in order to form their laws to isolate and ultimately destroy the Jews. So it's so you can't separate the 2 radically. But second, in the Germanic tradition, up until frankly recently, if someone was a Jew, you had to mention it, right? So they weren't a banker, they were a Jewish banker. They weren't an actor, you were a Jewish actor. They weren't a video game player, they were a Jewish video game player, right? You had to mention it. Now, I want everyone to think about the stories that they tell. And almost everyone in class is going to be guilty of this. If you are talking about, say, Claudia, Professor Routon, I don't know what they call you. They'll say, and you walked in she walked in the room and you didn't know her. You'd say, oh, this lady walked in and started speaking Spanish. But if Claudia were Black, almost all of you would say, oh, this Black lady walked in the room and started speaking Spanish. It is 100% normal in the United States to identify someone as Black, even if it's irrelevant to the story. And that is exactly the same linguistic mechanisms that the Germans used, because it's all the same thing, right? It's all the same structure and it's all intertwined. And so, again, in order to understand the world, you have to understand this stuff. And being Black has historically been called by Christians the mark of Cain, right? The mark of Cain and Abel are Adam and Eve's sons, right? So first, Adam and Eve are the only 2 human beings. They have 2 sons, and all of a sudden there's lots of people. So I don't know how that works, right? Although there is, in the Jewish tradition, actually Adam has a first wife, but that's neither here nor there. So God favors Abel, and both Cain and Abel sacrifice an animal. God favors Abel. Cain gets jealous and kills Abel. And God says, Cain, where is your brother, right? Already assuming a limited knowledge, not omnipotence. But God says, where is your brother? And Cain says, and we'll get back to this in just a second, Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Right? Famously, right? And God discovers that Cain is the first person to kill anyone, to slaughter anyone. And so he curses him and his descendants and gives him the mark of Cain. There's no description of what the mark of Cain is. It could be a mole. It could be, a stripe, it could be whatever. It doesn't even have to be physical. But Christianity has interpreted the mark of Cain as black skin, thereby indicating that black is a sign of even more original sin, even more dirtiness, even more corruptness, that the whiteness is inherently more pure, even though it has original sin, than the blackness, because the blackness added this curse and they're forced to wander the earth. Now, what I want to say, and I'll say this sort of a little more uplifting, because we've been doing this for a while, is how I always describe it, and I talk to my students, especially when I teach ethics, and this is in my writing on numerous occasions. The first question that human beings ask in the Abrahamic tradition is, am I my brother's keeper? That's the first question human beings ask. And that is the first question and the foundation of all questions that we as human beings need to ask ethically, which is, am I responsible for other people? Am I my sister's keeper? Am I my cousin's keeper? Am I my neighbor's keeper? Am I a stranger's keeper? What responsibility do I have to the Venezuelans who have walked 2,700 miles to come to America because their lives are in shambles? What responsibilities do I have to the Ukrainians when Russia invades them? What responsibility do I have to the homeless person who walks down the street? What responsibility do I have to someone who's walking down Merrifield Hall and their shoes are untied? Am I my brother's keeper? And independent of whether or not there is a right or wrong answer, I think there is, but whether or not there is a right or wrong answer, you learn a huge amount, and maybe everything you need to know, and I mean that hyperbole, but you know what I mean, everything you need to know by a person's answer to that question. Because if a person believes that they are their brother's keeper and acts on it, they're not just saying it, they are fundamentally different, and they exist in the world in a fundamentally different way than someone who believes that they are not their brother's keeper. And that is the first question of humanity, because it's the first question that makes human beings move from individuality to collectivity, right? You can be an individual and not concern yourself with being your sibling's keeper. But the moment you live with other people, that is the first question you ask, because it indicates how you treat others and how others treat you.
I could go on for hours. I think this is a wonderful place to stop, because it does leave us with that huge question. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and quite a powerful conversation for me. Thank you.
I do this for a living. Thank you very much. Thank you to your students for giving me all of your attention. There's 15 years, well, 14 full years of Y Radio, all for free. You can get the last 20 episodes on a podcast, but then, iTunes only keeps so many. But you go to whyradioshow.org, WHY radioshow.org. Also, we run a scholarship that I haven't sent out the posters or announcement yet. It's called the Glassheim Scholarship. It's $1,000 for if you write an essay and you win. And so it's on the portal, whatever it's called, the scholarship portal. So look that up, GLASSHEIM, or you can look up Institute for Philosophy of Public Life, I assume. I'd love for all of you, since it's a scholarship, you have to be enrolled at UND next year, but I'd love for all of you to contribute. There's a question this year, so that's already up. And if you have any questions or thoughts about this, other than trying to witness to me and try to convert me, you should feel free to reach out. I'm in the philosophy, just look at the philosophy department. I'm the only Weinstein in North Dakota. So, any of your students have any follow-up, that you should feel free to
Thank you. I've posted your information already.
Okay.
They have a link to the website and to the and to Y Radio and the Institute.
Excellent.
I'm going to stop the recording now
Okay.
and then see you in a minute.